Hello and welcome back to MLQ Replay. Week 5 is in the books. It was a quieter week, but the action was, I would say, some of the best we've had this season. Definitely one of the more exciting series we've had so far this season. I'm Ethan Sturm, along with Ben Mertens, here to break it all down. Obviously, MLQ coming into kind of a halfway point, a little break period with the World Cup coming up this weekend. Ben, you plan on going nocturnal at all this weekend?
What'd you say? Going what?
Nocturnal?
Nocturnal. I'm going to have to try to keep up with the scores somehow. You guys are, 6 hours ahead of us?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. But yeah, I think before that's all said and done, we need to talk about the series we had this past weekend. You know, in recent seasons, it's been the South Division that's kind of been a barn burner with all these close back and forth series. The East has been living up to it over the last couple of weeks, and we got a great one on Saturday between the Washington Admirals and the Charlotte Aviators. You know, a series that, as you mentioned last week, for all the talk of it being a very competitive series through the years, Charlotte only ever won a game in the series. They win 2 this weekend. They take the series for the first time ever, put themselves in pole position to get third place in the division, which would be the highest finish ever for the franchise. They did it in game 1 and game 2, 175-150 and 175-100. Washington able to take the last one, 175-120, to end up splitting the series when all is said and done. But I think game 1 is where anybody who watched the series would want to start. I think it's where we will start. I think it was kind of the decisive game when all is said and done. Washington comes out soaring, goes up 8-2, and Charlotte comes all the way back. So let's start on the Washington side since that's where the game started. Ben, what did you like about the Washington team that came out early on Saturday?
They looked really crisp. We've talked when we've managed about their New York series and their Ottawa series that they have a real definite plan on offense. And they were really able to stick to that for most of game 1 pre-SOP, and then things kind of went downhill. But they were able to build that very consistent lead because they were moving the ball well. They scored in different ways. They like to attack behind the hoops. They like to set up some hammer plays. John Gaffigan ripped a shot here and there, but it was a balanced scoring effort across the board. Everything looked consistent, and they just looked like they had Charlotte on the back foot, despite not getting out in transition a lot. Their half court was just so composed, they were able to generate a lot of points that way. And that got them out to a nice big lead. Their defense was playing well. Everything really seemed to be clicking for them until the 20-minute mark when Charlotte was really impressively able to come back. But those first 20 minutes of game 1 were excellent for Washington, and then they were able to kind of refine that in game 3, the one game that they managed to win. They're at their best really when they control the pace of the game and are generating those good looks in the half court. We saw them have one successful stretch in game 3 with the press defense we talked about, but otherwise they were sticking to a more conservative defense. And in game 1, that was working. I think that fell apart later in the series, but in game 1, they were dictating the terms through the first 20 minutes, and it looked like we were on our way to another Washington win.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, with no Riley Stars and no Brian Mulcahy this weekend, the question that was being asked in previews of the series, you know, is how the young core of DC, especially those UVA players, was going to step up. I thought Nathan John had a really big series. I think Chantal did as well. In that first game during that run, at one point, she just took on a 1v2 in a fast break, scored easily. Jen was on the receiving end of so many passes, seemed to be Gaffigan's favorite target for a lot of the series. So really exciting things there. I will say that while the lead did stretch to 8-2, and I think Charlotte went scoreless for 10 minutes, I think at one point during that first 20 minutes, there were like little hints because Charlotte was getting repeated good offensive looks. They just kept not finishing around the hoops. And, you know, you always wonder if at some point that should kind of start to change. And obviously it changed most rapidly at the 20-minute mark. You know, Charlotte had already tried to call timeout. That didn't really change the momentum that much. The game kind of stabilized to only being down 6, but they weren't really closing. And then the 20-minute mark came around and everything changed. What do you think happened in that brief but obviously very impactful flag runner on pitch period where it was a 65-0 run for Charlotte?
One thing we've done in pretty much every recap so far this season is complain that the winning team could have played even better. And game 1 kind of shows you why we harp on that, because Washington could have been up by more than 6, and that might have been enough to save that game for them, because Charlotte got a 6-0 combined run during SOP, and it really came down to how excellent Cody Lebov and Celine Richard were. They dominated SOP, not just giving only their seeker chances at the flag runner. They also were quickly pivoting into the quad ball game to force turnovers and clear easy lanes. Their chasers got 3 of the easiest goals they're going to get all season. Washington was trying to match the pace and instead just running, and then Cody would just pivot right back into the quad ball game, force a turnover. Charlotte's defense would have a chance to get back because he would slow up the break. It was the fastest 65-0 swing you're going to see in MLQ this season. And from there, now the game is tied. I thought Washington actually in that post-SOP period played about the same as they did in the first 20 minutes. They probably scored on roughly half of their offensive possessions, but Charlotte's offensive efficiency just skyrocketed. And that was all about continued great play from Cody and Selin, but also just kind of rising to meet the moment there. They got stops when they needed to. They were able to gut out some goals that really just came down to effort and hustle plays, and that was enough to put them over the top.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you mentioned Cody and Selin, who played basically every minute from the 20-minute mark till the end of that game. But also, I mean, Lee Hodge was extremely, extremely impactful for the entirety of this period. I mean, credit to Charlotte. They knew the 6, 7, if you want to consider including the seekers, the 6 or 7 people they wanted to play post 20 minutes in that game. Washington, as we said, a younger team, seemed like they were still kind of figuring that out. They had people coming in and out. Charlotte, had their line that they went out there, and they all performed. Thompson performed, Hodge performed. But yeah, I mean, I do think that Washington, the moment got a little bit big for them because it wasn't just that, which players are in or the beater difference. We saw some in flag runner and pitch, it was more, they took multiple long range shots in what was basically a rugby game, a no beater situation. I know Cody did end up flying in a couple of plays, but some long range shots. There was, a couple turnovers, one where 2 people both thought the other one was going to pick up the ball and roll back over half. One where a player just stepped right over half and immediately reset it. Just mistakes that younger players make. And Charlotte, to their credit, capitalized on just about all of them to get where they needed to at the end. And it kind of all culminated in, I thought, what was an awesome possession where Washington, we talked about in the Ottawa series, they have that press where they basically go full mark all over the field and they have their beater start half pitch. They leaned on that in kind of the decisive moment when Charlotte only needed 1. And it was really the individual effort. Lee just separated from a defender, chased down, was kind of an errant pass, kind of an attempted shot, hard to say. Got all the way back to it, was able to find a teammate, get the goal to put it away. Obviously we talked to Washington's leadership a couple weeks ago, and they talked about how they want to be, high pressure, high impact. What do you think about the decision to go with the press in that moment?
Well, it worked, and then Lee just beat everybody to loose ball. So I think it was not a bad decision at all. In fact, Charlotte kind of looked flustered. Cody and Selin were essentially just staying at half court. Zach Thompson, as soon as they had to set a foot across half court, just launched the ball. Maybe it was a shot, maybe it was a pass. But Lee just beat everybody to the ball. And then it kind of fell apart on the back end where you saw John Gaffigan, who had been the person kind of marking Thompson, then tried to streak in to block a potential shot, and that opened the pass up to Thompson for the winning goal. So I think the initial look was great. And if, Zach's shot has a little more heat on it, it rolls out of bounds or it bounces differently, maybe we're talking a little differently. But that was what we were talking about. The effort from Charlotte really separated in those last minutes. It looked like they had more energy left, a little more juice left, and they were able to do things like what Lee did there, get to a loose ball, get a second chance, and set up a great look. So I didn't hate the press at all from Washington. I like that they were trying to dictate the terms still and try to force the game to play the way they wanted to. Charlotte just outplayed them.
Yeah, for sure. And, you mentioned the high pressure and how that's kind of the way this team said they wanted to play. And you mentioned in game 3, they had a lot of success with the press. They obviously had success in that moment as well. It wasn't really what they led with in the series. We saw a lot of hoop zone from them. I don't think it was the strongest hoop zone we've seen this season. I don't think its rules were necessarily the strongest. And like we said, it's a team who kind of came in saying they wanted their identity to be a little bit higher pressure. So what do you think about Washington's choice to kind of play more of a conservative style defense for a lot of the series?
Yeah, I think part of it was they did not want to try that press too often against Cody and Selin. In game 3, the game Washington won, they really broke it out aggressively against the deeper beaters from Charlotte and had a lot of success there. Cody and Selin were eating Washington's beaters' lunches for most of game 1 and 2. And then I think, no Riley Stars and no Brian Mulcahy, they might have just been a little more nervous about their ability to meet up top because there were plays throughout the series where their point defender just got beat one-on-one, and then Charlotte's beaters, instead of having to worry about that, could be penetrating into the zone, messing with Washington's beaters, setting up hammers. things like that. I didn't think Nathan or Zan were weak links at the point of attack by any means, but they weren't Riley or Brian. They haven't played as long, and Charlotte was just able to take advantage of that. That said, in trees, they were still going to be at the point of attack too. There's no zone that really holds up if your point of attack gets beat. So I understand it. Charlotte has shooters. Zach Thompson had a great series. We haven't even mentioned him yet, and he has someone who is one of the better shots in the league. So I understand what they were going with their trees. It was more just they didn't have a counter to Charlotte's hammer, and everyone knows that hammer is kind of the offensive meta against trees, and Washington just didn't really have a great answer for that.
No, for sure. And yeah, I mean, I think, you mentioned it. Part of trees is, having control, being able to kind of be in a situation where you're creating some beater parity, and a lot of the beater parity was created when Leboeuf and Richard were not on the field. They basically, I don't think, played together in game one until the 20-minute mark, and then they came out immediately in game two and kind of ran up the score very quickly. And like you said, some of the chances Washington kind of jumped on in the next game were more when they were out of the game. There's been a lot of talk about, the Washington beater game for a number of years now. This weekend, no Diana Howard available. And you kind of really did feel the drop off after, the first line of Colin Bourne and Adrian Gretzky. What do you think about kind of where Washington is? And again, a lot of missing pieces, we've talked about it, but, it's always hard to play the sport if you can't, at least achieve that beater parity. Do you think they'll be able to do that, in big series, both the rest of the season and going into championships?
One thing I liked that they tried in game 3, which they won, was they shook Colin and Adrian off. They put Adrian with Rob Rice, who's a pretty capable second, and had Colin kind of go in with the younger beaters and try to cover them, and that worked much more effectively, I thought. So there's little things they can do with manipulating the pairs like that to squeeze more minutes out, right? That way they didn't feel like they had to keep rushing Adrian back into the game. They could survive more minutes without them. Diana Howard coming back will help. But they just need a little more in the beater game, because Colin and Adrian were still getting outplayed by Cody and Celine for large chunks of this game. And Washington needs an answer there if they're going to do anything against Boston in a couple of weeks, if they're going to do anything at champs. And I've seen Colin and Adrian have great moments in the past. I think this weekend they are tasked with doing a lot due to the struggles with depth and their chaser game being a little weaker than hopes. Stronger chaser game helps the beater game too. Everything is commingles. So if they get Riley Stars and Brian Mulcahy back, the beaters can focus a little more on counteracting their team's beaters instead of having to step up to drivers and things like that. There's things they can do, but I mean, they're going to get the test of the season, right? They're going to have to go up against Havlin and Jew in just a couple of weeks here. So we'll see how that goes for them.
Yeah, for sure. And, on the Charlotte side, we mentioned some of the good amount of the key contributors, but one I think we haven't touched on yet is Melissa Ross, a name that comes up a lot on this show that we've been high on in this program. Great target person for a lot of the drivers, was always, in good cutting spots, finished with 5 goals on the weekend. But, giving that extra little bit, because when you're, one thing we've seen with Charlotte in the past is, they need to be able to complete some passes, because you're not going to run through the top point defenders in this league. And, having players like that kind of gives them those added dynamics to, add a little bit more to their half court offense.
Yeah, and we should say for Charlotte too, because we've given Washington the disclaimer they didn't have everybody. No Ryan Davis for Charlotte this weekend, so they've now won this very crucial series for them. They're in a great position heading to champs, and they can expect to have potentially an even stronger roster at that tournament. So this was a really impressive win for them. It's always hard to beat the team that always beats you, especially when they go up like Washington did in game 1. I thought that was a lot of mental toughness showed by Charlotte to turn that game around, win the game, and go on to win the series.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you just don't see very often a quad ball game that starts 8-2 and the team with 2 wins, regardless of the scenario. And it is really impressive given all that. Just going through the sets, Nathan Dunn did lead the series, 12 goals to his name. Gabe Templeton, another young player from the Washington team, chipped in 5 as well. So, I think a lot for Washington to take out of this. I mean, but with the 2 losses, kind of seals their fate, because even a series win against Boston doesn't get them the 2 seed anymore. I guess it would cause them to re-jump Charlotte, but it seems like a tall task unless they can do a little bit more because we saw what Havlin and Shu did against Leboeuf and Richard. So it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out in a couple weeks.
Yeah, that's one of the more electric series we still have to look forward to. We were talking a little bit before this. There's some good stuff that we still have to wait for in the second half of the season. We'll have this little break here with World Cup, but there's a couple of really key series still to play out, and that's one of them. That's going to tell us if Washington, with more of their troops back, can do something a little more than they did this weekend. It's going to tell us about Boston too, who had that that upset win over New York. Needs to lock that series down to secure second in the division. So a lot to learn from that series.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a bit, but in the meantime, we're going to bring on our guest for the evening, head coach of the Charlotte Aviators, Allison Sleminski. Allison, thanks so much for taking the time tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And congrats to you guys on the win. It was a very fun series to watch, as you can tell. I want to jump right into that game one and kind of what was going on your guys' sidelines, as you were able to turn that game around from a game that I think a lot of us had kind of written off, when it was 8-2, at the 12, 13-minute mark.
I think every time we get in a huddle, whether it's beginning of the game, 20 minutes, or end of the game, it's always, what's the score? 0-0. So that we're focused on playing our game. If we don't care what's happened or what's about to happen, we're focused on one play at a time. So I think that was such a big piece of it going into game one, and can't not credit all of our players like Cody and Celine, Lee and Zach and Melissa, who really, really swung the momentum in that game, because we are such a momentum team that then carried us on into game two as well.
Can you talk to me about the, strategic way you kind of used Cody and Celine's minutes through the series? We saw them play a lot together, but also sometimes not in the Boston series. You kind of split them up a bit in game one. They played the end of that game together. They started game two. It's something we've seen from not just you guys, but a number of franchises this year, kind of splitting up your top pairs to kind of get more minutes with at least one of them on the field. So kind of what was your guys' ideas there?
Yeah, I think big one there, kind of what you talked about, splitting them up to kind of spread the wealth, but also to kind of give confidence in some of our younger players who haven't gotten some of those reps, like Stephanie Peck, Ren Morgan. I think to give them more reps at a kind of higher level. Just to spread the wealth, get everybody involved, because we want to play our whole line. We don't necessarily always want to run the same couple players. I know that was what game one kind of went with, but it's to also then give the confidence of some of our younger players or less experienced players that they can play in these intense games.
So Charlotte's kind of been in a very interesting spot basically since it's existed, where y'all, this year, obviously, like we said, are now in a position to finish third in the division, but really struggled to get over that fourth place spot in the division, but also, have made it to the quarterfinals a number of times, have gotten through the lower bracket. So when you guys are, going through that tough regular season slate, obviously that sweep against Boston to start the season, kind of how do you guys keep the mentality to kind of just keep running into the next series and then, pick up a big win like this, or, finish fourth in the division, but then, make that run to, quarterfinals or, upper bracket?
Yeah, I think the biggest change, at least in the last couple of weeks we've had, because coming out of that Boston series was obviously was a little upsetting, and I think we expected more of ourselves coming out of that series. So I think we played it a lot of trying to focus on our game. Like, obviously, we're going to game plan for each of the teams because every team is a little bit different. But what can we do, especially on our offense, especially with chasers, getting our chasers to feel more comfortable creating for themselves so we don't always have to rely on our beaters was such a big thing. And I think we showed progress on that throughout the Washington series, but I also think we can keep improving on that as we move into the back half of the season.
For sure. Yeah. Obviously, a lot of us are very familiar with kind of your top line that you ran that game one to kind of, seal up the win. But, Charlotte's always been a question of, with not a huge active scene, kind of where your youth, where your depth, where your growth is coming from. So talk to me about some of the younger players that you guys are kind of really excited about the development this season.
Yeah, well, I remember coming out of game one, and we had a conversation between the coaches and our top line to say, hey, like, what do we want to do? Like, do we want to just go hard game two, play everybody, or do we want to focus on getting some of our younger, our less experienced players than it was? We want to kind of get our younger, less experienced players more reps. I think, especially this series, both Caleb Brooks and Nick Thompson both stepped up offensively, and also folks like Corinne White and Bonnie Hernandez, who I think just have so much room to grow. And then on the beater side, I think there's been plenty of talk about how much Joshua Peck has improved, and getting to see him improve and get to play because he's been partnering a lot with Hannah Reese, who we're so excited to be a player this year rather than our manager. So I'm excited to keep integrating these folks and to build their confidence so that they're help us making plays and playing these big games.
So obviously you guys get the win game one, but the deal's not sealed until you win that second game. What was the, obviously happy, but what was the overall vibe, when you kind of finally got over the hill of taking a series off of Washington?
I mean, even coming from USQ, I think we kind of describe Washington as our white whale a little bit because it just a lot of these close things that go back and forth where we start out strong or Washington starts out strong. So I think it was so joyful and I think motivating for our team to kind of finally get over that hurdle. And I'm just so proud. Sorry, there's a fly in here. So proud of our players to kind of push through and show up on an important weekend for us.
You guys have kind of a quick turnaround into your New York series, and with a number of players unavailable to you guys, I know for a good amount of the period in between the two series. What is kind of the coaching staff's outlook going into that series? What are your goals looking to accomplish in that one?
I think with the New York series, because obviously we have several players traveling to Belgium for World Cup, that it's going to be a tough series, obviously, but that doesn't mean that we can't find successes and work on things that we're looking to improve on. And then obviously with some of our players being unavailable or coming back in, continuing to get some of those younger folks reps. That was really exciting to have Cole Tibbs on our roster this past weekend. I know you're familiar with him. He was a great asset, super good to learn. I think Lauren Hirsch has stepped up a lot. She's asked a million questions at practice, which is just so motivating on the coaching side.
Yeah, happy you guys have Cole, a great player, a great guy. But yeah, you guys have kind of, for a while there, as we were talking about, you guys are kind of like the kings of the lower bracket, but you always had to do it the hard way. If you guys lock up third, obviously you get that bye. Things you might actually be able to go into later rounds with a little more rest. Have you guys even considered that, or is it kind of still taking it one game at a time and headed to the New York series?
We definitely talked about champs because obviously you got to kind of game plan for it. But definitely more taking the one practice, one series at a time. As I said, focus on the things that we can control and get better at the skills that we need to get better at. Because obviously, like I said, we had a great weekend, but I think there's definitely room for some improvement for the rest of the season.
Awesome. Well, Allison, thanks so much for taking the time tonight. Best of luck to you guys in that New York series, and we look forward to seeing you there and at champs.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So we're going to bring Ben back in to talk a little bit about, the second half of the season, as we kind of go into the All-Star break, as it were. But Ben, we decided to kind of structure it as looking at where the bracket stands. And obviously, we were just talking to Allison about, certain parts of the bracket. But I think some of that's really up for grabs. So I think we have to at least briefly focus on the series that are still going to be very decisive in that bracket. So, starting in the upper bracket, this year, the North Division is going to be making the decision about what division their 1 seed wants to play. That division's 2 seed. That 1 seed is almost certainly going to either be Chicago or Minneapolis. They're playing against each other in a super series that includes Toronto in a few weeks. What do you think about that Minneapolis versus Chicago matchup?
I think on paper, this is probably the best Minneapolis roster we've seen. It has the talent, I would say, to go toe-to-toe with the Chicago team and beat them. Obviously, in the regular season, not the exact same rosters, but we saw that TCQC team that has some of these Minneapolis players have a ton of success. We saw a bit of a down year from that Boom Train team that has a lot of those Chicago players. So on paper, it's possible. We've barely seen either team play despite being at the halfway point of the season. 1 series a pop against teams who they dispatched pretty handily. I think, obviously, Cleveland beat Chicago by a bigger margin than Minneapolis beat Detroit, but Minneapolis was in control of that series for the most part, I thought. And Minneapolis is a team that's heavily reliant on some younger players. And we need to see, the Chicago team is going to be a huge test for them. I think even if Minneapolis loses that series, getting to play a team of Chicago's caliber in the regular season is a great setup for champs, so they aren't caught off guard when they have to play someone like New York or Boston or San Antonio at an early point. But I think they could win that series. I think it's the biggest question mark we still have in this season is what both teams are able to do in that series, because those are two teams. It's the only matchup we have left between two definitive top 5 teams, and whoever wins it is going to have a really great path at MLQ champs.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of it's going to be coming down to, is this Minneapolis team, capable of neutralizing Matt Brown, who really seems to be playing at an extremely high level at the moment, obviously returning to the team, and not to sell the, Minneapolis core short when it comes to beating, but we've seen what, a top beater can do to a series. We've seen it a number of times already this season. So I do think that'll be really interesting. I think most people would be lying to you if they didn't say that they expect Chicago to have the edge in that series, but that's not very controversial. Chicago's been to back-to-back finals.
Right.
When we, if Chicago were to take that number 1 seed, they'd be choosing between, well, we have to imagine at this point, will be Boston out of the East. It would take, I'll be honest, I haven't done the math. It might take literally, if Washington sweeps them, I think Boston still might be the 2 seed, but
Washington sweeps, they'll have 7, and Boston will also have 7, but Washington will have the tiebreaker. So Washington has to sweep, otherwise it's over.
Yes. Yeah. Perfect. So if that wasn't the case, which again, if Washington just had to win 2 of 3, the sweep seems like a tall order for sure. Chicago would be choosing between Boston and what we most likely assume was Kansas City at this point, with Kansas City being on the side of the bracket with a New York, and with Boston being on the side of the bracket with San Antonio. What do you think about those sides of the bracket and the choice that this North team might be facing this year?
I think obviously this Kansas City team is, every year Kansas City is a really exciting team, and then there's a ton of roster turnover, and it's still a really exciting team, but there's some year-to-year turnover here that I think makes them probably less threatening to a veteran team looking at that matchup than Boston. But it's, you don't want to take that Kansas City team lightly. But I think the interesting thing, as you said, is the pick is not only about who you're going to face in that first round, it's about setting up the rest of the bracket for you. I think Chicago is very familiar with New York. They've beat them 2 years ago, lost them last year in the finals, plenty of USQ history between those teams too. San Antonio is more wild card, right? This is going to be a different San Antonio team than we've seen in the past with Hayden Boys at the helm, ton of Team USA talent on it. I think as much in consideration in Chicago or Minneapolis' decision is not just that first round matchup, but the second round matchup that it sets up for you.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously we do actually still have to see that San Antonio Kansas City series play out. That's a big one, obviously, on the back half of our calendar as well. When we kind of look at the lower bracket, like we mentioned, Charlotte, if they can secure the 3, which again would take a number of wins from Washington against Boston to jump over that, they'd be getting one of the buys. One of the buys would also be going to the winner of the Houston-Austin series, and then most likely it'd be Cleveland and Detroit and Washington, as well as the loser of that Austin-Houston series that would be playing in the first round. What teams do you kind of like to possibly make the run to get out and make a quarterfinal run based on what we've seen so far?
I think there is a great chance that it's the 2 teams we've been talking about all day today. I think that Washington and Charlotte both have a great shot to come out of that bracket. Just looking at the teams from the other divisions, we have not seen Austin play yet this season. We know they have a very short roster. We obviously can't say anything too definitive about them until we see them play, but it's a short and pretty young roster. League City, we have seen have that tough loss against San Antonio. Would like to see, how they do against that Austin team. That'll kind of give us a feel for how they'll do in that bracket. And the 2 North teams, most likely at this point, Detroit and Chicago, they still need to play, or Detroit and Cleveland, they still need to play each other. We've liked what we've seen from Cleveland. That's a really young team who I think would struggle against a Charlotte, a Washington, even a League City come the bracket. Detroit, similar situation. They have the higher beater ceiling. And we saw, again, that kind of Detroit versus Washington, I think, would be a very interesting one because of the high ceiling beaters Detroit has and how we've seen Washington kind of struggle to match top level beaters. But we've had at least 2 seasons where Washington and Charlotte, both out of the East Division, came out. Last year we saw both South teams be the teams to make it out. I think we have a great shot for another year where one division kind of sweeps that lower bracket. I still like Washington's chances, despite what we saw this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were anybody to be, offended at your comments, it'd probably be Houston, who I think has played two pretty competitive series against two solid franchises already. Obviously, there were things we didn't love about the defense last week, and a team like Washington with the passing we saw might pick that apart. But I do think they'll be in contention. I think it's, as it has been in recent years, I think it's going to be a pretty competitive lower bracket. I think obviously it's going to be a tall task for any teams that come out of that, to take on what could be, a San Antonio, a New York, even a KC, when all is said and done. But obviously it means a lot to make it to that stage either way. I think it's going to be a fun Saturday afternoon as we kind of watch these teams go at it, because I don't think many of them are going to, just keel over it. As, sometimes we do see overmatched teams in the lower bracket, but you can really pick out parts of each team, as you mentioned, like Detroit's beating, Houston's ability to, string together passes, Washington's offense that we saw this weekend, Charlotte's kind of the whole package, especially from that top line. So a lot of fun things that'll be going on in there. When we go to the late bracket and the late rounds, we've talked about it here and there, but who do you like amongst those top teams to, most likely be finalists and possible champions?
I think San Antonio, if what we were just talking about comes to pass, and New York and Chicago play in the semifinals, you really like San Antonio's chances to go through a team that had to struggle through the play-in bracket in the morning, then face off against Boston, which is never easy, but we've seen Boston have a ton of turnover this year. They're relying heavily on a very young chaser core to go along with those great beaters. San Antonio is probably the team in the country best equipped to match Boston beater-wise, even with Max and Lulu out there. So much talent from San Antonio in the beater game. So I think San Antonio has a great chance to come into championships, having only played 4 games, right? Potentially sweep the quarterfinals. Great chance to sweep the semis too. We can't count Boston out. Boston has made so many runs over the years. That's kind of surprise run to the finals against Austin a few years ago. And they could definitely do that again. But San Antonio, I think, will have the best chances to definitely be a finalist. And then I really don't want to count out Minneapolis yet, because I think that is a team with a really high ceiling if it all comes together. But the likeliest thing we're looking at, right, is Chicago and New York, again, kind of the rubber match after Chicago beat them 2 years ago, and then New York beats them in the finals last year. And just so much history going into that matchup. A lot still unknown, right? Chicago has to face their hardest test of the season, which is Minneapolis. New York, we haven't seen kind of the full team yet. We've seen struggles against Boston despite all the talent. So kind of the surprising thing when Chicago upset them 2 years ago was that they looked like the more composed, put together team than New York. If that can be the case again this year, especially with Matt Brown back in the fold, who New York really struggled against 2 years ago, I like Chicago on that matchup. But it's going to come down to who plays better come that Sunday morning.
Yeah, no, I think we could be in, if the bracket falls the way it does, and there's a lot of teams who are going to have a say to that. But if, you're looking at a Boston, San Antonio semifinal and a Chicago, New York semifinal, both of those series have a lot of history, high stakes. I mean, San Antonio's never been in the finals. Those players have come up short to Boston a number of times. New York, Chicago, the last 2 seasons, obviously the finals, but also that semifinal. And I think when you consider roster talent on the two sides, I do think that these two teams are probably matched closer to the way they were in 2023 than they were in 2024. So I would expect a very good series. We haven't always had the most competitive semifinals, but I really think these ones might deliver. But yeah, awesome. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. We know a lot of people are traveling. We're not going to keep you too long. But yeah, we will be off next week, as will all of MLQ. We hope you enjoy World Cup 2025 in Belgium. And we will be back. MLQ will be back the following weekend. We will be back the Tuesday after that. The next weekend will be Austin taking on Houston. Sorry, I apologize. Let me correct that. It'll be Charlotte taking on New York, Detroit taking on Chicago. Will be our series as we return from World Cup. Thanks everybody for watching tonight. Ben, thanks for coming on with me. Harry, thank you for producing. I'm signing off for tonight. Everybody have a good one.